I didn't cheat. I didn't kiss him. I didn't touch him. But I also didn't stop what was happening. It started with small conversations, then longer ones, then the kind I didn't mention at home. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself nothing. Physical meant nothing was wrong. That was the first lie. I'm a woman in my early 30s, in a long-term relationship that looks stable from the outside. We live together. We have routines. We talk about the future like people who assume everything is fine. I wasn't looking for problems. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't trying to replace anyone or cross any lines. This started during a normal phase of life. Work, stress, familiar days blending together, no big fights, no dramatic distance, just comfort and repetition. I didn't notice the shift at first. By the time I did, I was already protecting something I hadn't planned to create. That's when I realized this wasn't about attraction or attention. It was about the choices I didn't interrupt soon enough. What do you think? When does something innocent stop being innocent? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories like this, subscribe and share this story with someone who might relate. At first, there was nothing to confess. No secret meetings. No hidden messages at midnight. No tension I could clearly point to and say, this is where it went wrong. It started at work. Same building. Different teams. Someone I had seen around but never really noticed. One day, we ended up waiting for the elevator together. He made a comment about a meeting that had gone badly. I laughed. I added something of my own. That was it. Later that afternoon, he sent me a message about it. Work-related, light, normal. I remember thinking, this is fine. People talk, people joke, people connect over shared frustrations. Over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. Quick messages during breaks, short comments after meetings, nothing personal, nothing deep. But I started looking forward to them. Not in a romantic way. That's what I told myself. More like a break in the day. Someone who noticed when I was overwhelmed. Someone who responded quickly. I didn't hide it at first. If my partner asked how my day was, I'd mention work, meetings, stress. I just didn't mention him, and that felt normal too. Why bring up something insignificant? Then one evening, my partner asked who I was texting. I answered without thinking. Just someone from work. He nodded, didn't ask more. But later that night, I realized something uncomfortable. I wouldn't have been as calm if he'd asked to see the messages. That's when I felt the first flicker of guilt. Small, easy to ignore. The kind you silence by telling yourself you're overreacting. I wasn't cheating. I knew that. But for the first time, I wondered why I felt the need to reassure myself so strongly. Was I wrong for not setting a boundary the moment I noticed that feeling? After that night, I told myself I would be more aware. Not stop talking to him. That felt dramatic. Just pay attention. Make sure nothing crossed a line. But awareness didn't make it stop. It made it clearer. I started noticing how often I checked my phone at work, how quickly I replied to his messages compared to everyone else, how I smiled at the screen before realizing I was doing it. Still, everything we said stayed safe. No flirting. No compliments about looks. No obvious signals that would justify alarm. That made it harder to call it a problem. One afternoon, he asked how I was doing, not about a task or a deadline, just me. I answered honestly, more honestly than I usually did with anyone at work. Then he shared something personal too. Stress, pressure, feeling stuck. I remember thinking, this is just two adults talking. People are allowed to connect. It didn't mean anything. But I didn't mention that conversation at home that night. Not because I was hiding it, that's what I told myself, but because it felt separate. Like something that belonged to a different part of my life. My partner talked about his day. I listened. I responded. Everything looked normal. Yet there was a quiet comparison happening in my head, one I didn't ask for, one I didn't want to admit. At work, someone was curious about my thoughts. At home, things were familiar, efficient, predictable. None of that meant something was wrong. Long relationships go through phases. Comfort isn't a failure. But that night, lying in bed, I realized something else. If my partner had described the same kind of conversations with another woman, the frequency, the openness, the emotional ease, I wouldn't have liked it. And that realization stayed with me longer than I wanted. Was I already crossing a line by keeping this part of my day to myself? After that realization, I tried to pull back. Not abruptly. Not in a way anyone would notice. Just small adjustments I could justify to myself. I took longer to reply. I kept responses shorter. I told myself I was busy, which was true. For a few days, it worked. The space felt uncomfortable at first, like breaking a habit. Then it felt responsible. Until he noticed. He asked if everything was okay. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple question. I said yes. Of course I did. And somehow, that opened the door again. The conversations resumed, but now they felt different. More intentional. Like we were both aware of the pause that had happened. One afternoon, he told me he felt comfortable talking to me. That it wasn't like this with most people at work. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the message longer than I should have. There it was, not a confession, not a flirt, but something close enough to make my chest tighten. I typed a neutral response. I kept it polite. I didn't encourage it, but I didn't shut it down either. That night, my partner asked why I seemed distracted. I blamed work. Again. The lie wasn't dramatic. It was convenient, and that scared me more than anything else. Because I realized I was no longer just omitting details. I was actively choosing what version of my day he was allowed to see. I wasn't cheating. Nothing physical had happened. Nothing romantic had been said. But I had created a space where honesty was starting to feel optional. And once that door opens, it's hard to pretend it doesn't exist. At this point, should I have been honest? Even if nothing wrong had technically happened? After that, I started paying attention to my own behavior in a way that made me uncomfortable. Not to him, to myself. I noticed how I positioned my phone when I was at home, how I angled the screen slightly away without thinking, how I checked messages quickly, almost automatically. Nothing to hide, yet everything to protect. At work, we didn't seek each other out. No lunches together, no walks, no moments that could be questioned from the outside. That made it easier to justify everything. We were just two people talking during the day. That's all. Until one afternoon, I had a rough meeting. The kind that leaves you quiet, frustrated, questioning yourself. Before I even thought about it, I messaged him, not my partner. Him. He responded immediately. Listened. Validated. Said things like, "That sounds really hard," and anyone would feel like that. It felt good. Too good. That night, my partner asked how work went. I gave him the short version, the clean version, the version without emotion. Later, lying next to him, I realized something that made my stomach drop. I had gone to someone else first, not for advice, not for solutions, but for understanding. And I hadn't even paused to consider why. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People can have emotional support outside their relationship. That's healthy, right? But then I asked myself a harder question. If my partner had needed comfort that day, would I have noticed? Or was I already directing that part of myself somewhere else? I didn't have an answer I liked. Was the real problem the conversations, or the fact that I was choosing them over my own relationship? After that night, I promised myself I would reset things, not confront anyone, not confess anything dramatic. Just quietly bring my focus back where it belonged. I made an effort at home. I asked more questions. I listened without multitasking. I tried to be present in a way that felt intentional, not automatic. And for a moment, it helped. But during the day, at work, the contrast became impossible to ignore. With my partner, conversations were layered with history, logistics, expectations. With him, they were light, immediate, uncomplicated. That difference didn't mean one was better, but it did mean one was easier. One afternoon, he mentioned he might be leaving the company, nothing confirmed, just considering options. The idea surprised me more than it should have. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest. I asked questions I didn't need to ask. When? Why? Where he might go. Later, I caught myself replaying that conversation, imagining the office without him, imagining the silence. That's when it hit me. I wasn't afraid of losing a coworker. I was afraid of losing access to the version of myself I became in those conversations. That scared me enough to finally do something. I decided I would tell my partner, not everything, because there was no everything, just enough to be honest. But every time I imagined that conversation, my mouth went dry. How do you explain something that never crossed a clear line without making it sound worse than it was, or smaller than it felt? That night, I said nothing. Again, and I realized something else. Silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was a choice. At this point, was I protecting my relationship, or protecting myself from consequences? The next week felt heavier than the ones before. Nothing had changed on the surface. Same routines, same messages, same evenings at home. But inside, I was carrying the awareness that I was running out of excuses. At work, he sensed it again, noticed the hesitation, the slight distance I was trying to maintain. He didn't push. That almost made it worse. One afternoon, we ran into each other in the hallway. No messages, no screens, just real space between us. He asked how I was doing. The question was simple. The answer wasn't. I gave a vague response. He nodded, then said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. I don't want to make things complicated for you. He said it calmly, not accusing, not dramatic, but it confirmed something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud. He knew this wasn't nothing. That night, my partner talked about a stressful situation at work. I listened, but part of my attention drifted. I hated myself for that, because in that moment, I realized how unfair this had become. Not because of another person, but because of my own divided presence. I wasn't fully here. I wasn't fully anywhere. I went to bed feeling restless, my thoughts looping around the same question. If I truly believed I had done nothing wrong, why did the idea of transparency feel so threatening? I didn't want to hurt anyone. But I was starting to see that avoiding pain now might be creating something worse later. And the worst part, I still hadn't decided what I was going to do next. If you sense a line but can't clearly define it, are you still responsible for crossing it? The tension didn't explode. It settled. That was the problem. There was no argument to react to, no message I could point to and say, this is where it ends. Just a quiet shift in how everything felt. I started noticing what I didn't say out loud anymore. Thoughts I edited before speaking, reactions I softened, moments I kept to myself. Not because my partner wouldn't understand, but because explaining would force me to define something I'd worked hard not to name. At work, the conversations changed again. Fewer messages, more pauses. When we did talk, there was a careful distance we both pretended was natural. But every now and then, there would be a look, a brief moment of recognition, like we were both aware of what we were not acknowledging. One evening, my partner picked up my phone to check the weather. Something ordinary, something harmless. My heart raced anyway. He didn't scroll, didn't question, didn't notice anything unusual, but the reaction stayed with me. Fear doesn't come from nothing. It comes from knowing there's something you don't want examined too closely. That night, I realized I had crossed a line I never meant to approach. Not by doing something obvious, but by creating a version of my life that required silence to survive. I lay awake, thinking about trust. Not his trust in me, but my own. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped acting like the person I believed I was. And I didn't know how to fix that without breaking something. If nothing inappropriate happened, why did I feel like I was already asking for forgiveness? By then, I was exhausted in a way sleep didn't fix. Not physically, mentally. Every interaction required calculation. What I shared, what I didn't. What felt honest versus what felt safe. I told myself this would fade. That time would dull whatever this was. That distance would solve a problem I still refused to name. But distance didn't bring relief. It brought awareness. At work, I became hyper-conscious of my behavior. The way I spoke. The way I reacted when his name came up in conversations. The way my body tensed before I even saw him. I hated that something so quiet had so much control over me. One afternoon, he sent a message I didn't open right away. Not because I was busy, but because I was afraid of how easily I would fall back into the rhythm. I let it sit there, unread. Minutes passed. Then more. Instead of relief, I felt loss. That scared me more than anything else so far. Because it meant I wasn't just avoiding temptation. I was grieving something I had no right to grieve. That night, my partner talked about making plans for the future. Nothing dramatic. Trips, ideas. The usual someday conversations. I responded. I smiled. I nodded. But inside, I felt disconnected from the version of myself sitting across from him. Not because I didn't love him, but because I didn't feel fully present in my own life anymore. I realized something uncomfortable then. The real damage wasn't happening at work. It wasn't happening in messages. It was happening in the space between who I was claiming to be and who I was quietly becoming. And I didn't know which version I was more afraid of losing. The one who felt chosen in small moments, or the one who had built a life based on long-term trust. For the first time, I considered a possibility I had avoided until then, that even without betrayal, even without touch, even without intention, I might still have to make a choice, and no version of that choice felt clean. If staying silent protects everyone for now, is it still wrong, or just selfish in a quieter way? By the time I accepted that a decision was unavoidable, I was already carrying the weight of having delayed it too long. Nothing dramatic forced my hand, no confession, no discovery, no moment where everything collapsed at once. Just a slow, quiet understanding that things don't stay unresolved forever. At work, he gave notice. I found out the way everyone else did, through a short announcement, polite reactions, casual goodbyes. I smiled. I said the right things. Inside, I felt something close to panic. Not because I wanted something with him. That explanation would have been easier, cleaner. It was because his leaving meant this chapter would end without ever being named, and I wouldn't get to pretend it was harmless anymore. He messaged me later that day. Nothing emotional, just a thank you. For listening, for being kind. I stared at the screen for a long time. I could have replied with something equally safe. Professional, friendly, final. Instead, I wrote a longer message. Still careful. Still appropriate. But honest in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be before. I told him our conversations mattered to me. That they came at a time when I didn't realize how much I needed to feel understood. That I was grateful, and that it couldn't continue. I didn't send it right away, because I knew what sending it would mean. It would close one door and force me to look directly at another. That night, I finally spoke to my partner. Not everything. Not every detail, but the truth where it counted. I told him I had let an emotional connection grow outside our relationship, that nothing physical happened, that I stopped it when I understood what it was becoming. He listened, quietly, longer than I expected. What he said next wasn't anger, it was disappointment, and somehow that hurt more. Was telling the truth at the end an act of integrity, or just too late to matter? The days after that conversation were some of the hardest I've lived through. Not because we were fighting. We weren't. It was quieter than that. My partner didn't punish me. He didn't interrogate me. He didn't demand details I hadn't offered. Instead, he became distant in a way that felt heavy with thought. That distance forced me to sit with something I had avoided for a long time. The fact that trust doesn't break only when someone cheats. Sometimes it erodes when someone redirects their emotional honesty elsewhere. We talked, slowly, carefully, about routines, about complacency, about how easy it is to confuse comfort with neglect, and novelty with connection. I owned my part without minimizing it. I didn't say nothing happened as a defense. I said, something almost did, because I didn't stop it soon enough. That mattered, not because it erased what I did, but because it named it honestly. I cut contact completely, not out of guilt, out of clarity. I needed my actions to match the version of myself I wanted to be again. Rebuilding wasn't immediate. Some days still aren't easy. But something shifted when I stopped lying, not just to my partner, but to myself. I learned that boundaries aren't about avoiding temptation. They're about protecting the life you've chosen before you have to defend it. I didn't cheat. That's true. But I also learned that fidelity starts much earlier than people like to admit. And if I hadn't faced that when I did, I know exactly how this story could have ended. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.